You don't think about death the way your ancestors did. Not even close. For most of human history, roughly 300,000 years of it, death wasn't something that happened in a hospital room, behind closed doors, managed by strangers in white coats. It happened in front of you. It happened next to you. Sometimes it happened to the person whose hand you were holding. And somehow, that changed everything about how early humans lived. Right now, the average person in the modern world will reach adulthood before witnessing a single death. For your ancestors on the African savanna, that number would have seemed impossible. Death was not an abstraction. It was a presence, something you smelled, heard, and grieved out in the open, together. So what did death actually look like for ancient humans? What happened when someone in your band stopped breathing? What did they believe? What did they do? And what did it cost them to keep going? The answer is stranger, more tender, and more human than you might expect. Let's start with the numbers because they're staggering. Paleodemographer Rachel Caspari, whose landmark 2004 study analyzed dental wear across 4 major hominin populations, found that for most of human prehistory, almost no one survived past the age of 30. In the earliest populations she studied, Australopithecus and early Homo, for every one individual who lived to what we'd consider middle age, there were roughly 10 who died young. Young deaths, constant deaths, deaths from infection, from predators, from childbirth, from injury, from cold, from thirst. Your band was small, usually between 15 and 50 people. You knew everyone by name. You had grown up with them, hunted with them, slept beside them. When one of them died, it wasn't a statistic, it was a rupture. Grief, in that context, wasn't something you scheduled. It was something that rolled over you like weather. The oldest evidence of intentional burial comes from a cave in South Africa called Border Cave, where archaeologists discovered the deliberate interment of an infant, placed carefully in a pit accompanied by a perforated shell dating to roughly 74,000 years ago. The shell may have been a personal ornament, something precious. Someone chose to put it in the ground with a child they had lost. That act, choosing to bury rather than abandon, choosing to mark a body with something meaningful, tells us something profound. Your ancestors were not simply disposing of the dead, they were doing something for them, something that required belief. Belief that the dead were still, in some sense, present. That what happened to the body after death still mattered. Archaeologist Paul Pettitt, who has spent decades cataloging burial practices across the Paleolithic, argues that the impulse toward mortuary ritual didn't emerge suddenly. It evolved slowly, over hundreds of thousands of years, from basic body protection, covering the dead to prevent scavenging, into something richer and more deliberate. By the time of the Neanderthals, and certainly by the time of anatomically modern humans, the dead were being treated with ceremony. Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, excavated in the 1950s and 60s by Ralph Selecki, yielded the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals, one of whom, Shanidar Wuerst, had survived severe injuries that should have been fatal. A withered arm, a crushed eye socket, healed fractures across his body. He lived for years after these injuries. That means someone fed him, tended to him, kept him alive when he could no longer contribute to the group's survival. This is not the behavior of creatures indifferent to each other's suffering. This is care. This is love, expressed in the oldest possible language. So what actually happened in the hours and days after someone died? Forensic anthropologist Briana Pobiner, whose research at the Smithsonian traces the deep history of human behavior, notes that early modern humans almost certainly had immediate physical responses to death that we would recognize today: crying, rocking, reluctance to leave the body. Primate studies support this. Chimpanzees and gorillas have been documented carrying deceased infants for days, grooming them, refusing to abandon them. Your ancestors almost certainly did the same. The band would have gathered. There would have been sound, wailing, possibly rhythmic, possibly communal. There is evidence from sites like Qafzeh Cave in Israel, where modern humans were buried with red ochre staining their bones as early as 100,000 years ago, that the dead were painted before burial. Red ochre, the color of blood, the color of life. An act of preparation, of farewell. The body might be placed in a flexed position, knees drawn to the chest, as if sleeping, sometimes facing east toward the rising sun, sometimes accompanied by tools, by food, by objects that had meaning. Not because the living expected the dead to use them, or perhaps exactly because they did. Here is the part that changes how you think about ancient grief. Your ancestors processed death communally, ritually, and repeatedly because they had no other choice. There was no grief counselor, no funeral home, no cultural script that told you to feel better in 6 months and move on. Death was woven into the fabric of everyday life, and so grief was too. Wiessner, an anthropologist at the University of Utah who spent decades studying the hoansi sand people of the Kalahari, one of the most studied hunter-gatherer societies still living in a way that echoes the deep past, documented how death in small bands functions as a social rupture that the entire group must actively repair. Stories are told about the dead. Their names are spoken, or in some groups deliberately not spoken for a period to let the loss settle. Food is shared. The bereaved are not left alone. Grief in that world was not private. It was performed, witnessed, and absorbed collectively. Which raises an unsettling question for you, living now. The modern world has largely dismantled those collective rituals. We grieve privately, quickly, and often alone. We are surrounded by more people than any human ancestor ever was, and yet we die and are mourned in near total isolation. Your ancestors would not have understood that. They would not have thought it was better. There is one more piece to this that is easy to overlook. The dead did not simply disappear from the minds of early humans. They persisted. Across dozens of archaeological sites, from the decorated caves of southern France to the burial grounds of the Levant, there is evidence that the dead were returned to, revisited, sometimes exhumed. At Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, one of the world's earliest known settlements dating to roughly 9,000 years ago, excavations by Ian Hodder's team revealed that the dead were buried directly beneath the floors of houses. Families slept above their ancestors. The dead were not put away, they were kept close. In some cases, skulls were removed from burials, replastered with clay to reconstruct faces, and displayed, almost certainly as a way of keeping the presence of the dead alive in the community. These were not trophies, they were portraits, attempts to hold on. Your ancestor understood, in a way that required no theology and no philosophy, that the people they loved did not simply stop existing when their hearts stopped. They continued to exist in memory, in story, in the shape of grief they left behind in the living. So let's reconstruct the moment. Someone in your band has died. They were 42 years old by the standards of your world. A hunter, a storyteller, someone whose voice you knew before you knew your own name. The body is laid out near the fire. The band gathers without being called. They simply come, the way humans always have, toward the thing they cannot fix. Someone begins to keen, low, rhythmic, a sound that is not quite language. Others join. There are hands on shoulders, foreheads pressed together, the physical grammar of shared devastation. A child watches from the edge of the firelight, wide-eyed, learning what death looks like for the first time, because in this world, children are not protected from it. Red ochre is brought. The body is painted with care. A hand tool is placed beside the left hand, the one that was most skilled. Someone tucks a small shell near the head. The pit is dug, and the next morning, life continues. It has to. The band moves on, because bands that stop moving die. But the dead hunter moves with them. In the stories told at night, in the grief that resurfaces unpredictably, in the particular silence that opens up in moments where their voice would have been. You will die. You have always known this. But your ancestors knew it differently. They knew it up close, young, surrounded by people who would not let them face it alone. They knew it as a shared condition, something the entire band held together, not something shuffled off to professionals and managed out of sight. The oldest burial in the world is not a monument to death. It is a monument to the refusal to let someone disappear without witness. You wake up and you carry the dead with you. So did they. So did every human who ever lived. For 300,000 years, that was the deal. And somewhere beneath the way you grieve, the throat that tightens, the instinct to gather, the need to say a name out loud one more time, that ancient understanding is still running. It never really stopped.